In May of 2024, my wife and I took our first trip to Washington, D.C., and we spent 4.5 days there. Here's an overview of what we did, what we learned, and our advice on what to do and what not to do when traveling to Washington, D.C. for the first time. The United States Capitol is full of historical sites, memorials, museums, and lots more. So let's get started. First off, about our hotel. We stayed at the Hilton, Washington, D.C. National Mall, The Wharf, and we highly recommend it. It has a long name, but it's called that because the hotel is midway between the National Mall, where most of the monuments and museums are, and the Wharf, which is a waterfront area of dining, shops, and nightlife along the Potomac River. The location of the hotel was perfect for us. It's located right in the middle of L'Enfant Square, hope I pronounced that right, and just beneath it is a major transfer station for all of the DC Metro lines. That means you can hop on the DC subway, known in DC as the Metro, and go just about anywhere for only a couple of bucks. More about the Metro later. The hotel has a Starbucks in the lobby, an adjacent shopping center with a food court, a rooftop pool that's open only during the summer, a solid hotel bar, and a pretty impressive fitness center. Our room was very spacious and we couldn't have been happier with this hotel. From the hotel, it's just a few minutes walk to the Capitol building, the Washington Monument, or the Wharf area. As for things to do in DC, there are tons, and you're not going to be able to do everything in a week, so you'll need to prioritize. I will broadly categorize attractions in DC into 3 categories. 1, things to see, 2, tours to take, and 3, museums. Things to see. For things to see, we're talking about a lot of monuments and memorials. We knocked a lot of these out on our first day just by walking around the National Mall area and getting oriented with the city. We saw the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and memorials for the World War I, World War II, Korean, and Vietnam Wars. We also went to the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial, which holds a place near and dear in my heart. Many of these memorials are totally different experiences at night than they are at day. In particular, the Lincoln Memorial and the Korean War memorials, you should go see them at night, just trust me. There are many others throughout the area, including the Martin Luther King Memorial and smaller statues all around the National Mall area. But individually, you may only spend 15 or 20 minutes at each one, so they're easy to check off your bucket list. Tours to take. There are plenty of tours to be taken around Washington, D.C., and obviously I can't speak for all of them, but for tours to the U.S. Capitol, the White House, and the Supreme Court buildings, if you live in the United States, you can contact your local congressional office and request tours online for free. I'll put a link below for where you go to do that. We did this for all of the buildings a few days in advance, but the only one we were actually successful in getting was the U.S. Capitol tour. It's my understanding that the White House is practically impossible to get a tour for, so you will probably have to settle for seeing it from a distance like we did. Now, anyone can go to the Capitol building and get a tour. There are separate lines for walk-ins and for those with reservations. But a tour from your congressman's office is a small group led by an intern for people just from your congressional district. So the 4 other people that were on our tour were all from the area we lived, which was kind of cool. And we didn't have to wait in line. I definitely recommend requesting a tour through your representative's office if you can. That being said, the tour of the Capitol is somewhat cursory. You get to see some of the older parts of the building that are no longer in use. And depending on whether or not Congress is in session, you may be able to walk into the House gallery after handing over your cell phone and any other possible recording devices. The whole tour took about an hour. The Library of Congress is nearby, and it was one of the many things we didn't get to but wished we had. We didn't do this either, but a friend who was there at the same time told us that there were certain hours you could walk through the Supreme Court building when they're not in session. One tour we did pay for, and we're happy we did, was Arlington National Cemetery. This is about a 20-minute metro ride outside of downtown Washington, D.C. This is probably the most iconic military cemetery in the world, with over 400,000 burial sites. It's also where you'll find the Kennedy family gravesite, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, something I highly recommend checking out, the Iwo Jima Memorial, and the former home of General Robert E. Lee. The story of how General Lee's wife's property was turned into a cemetery following the Civil War is pretty interesting. You don't technically need to pay for a tour here, but the site is enormous and wandering around on foot would take a while. With the paid tour, you get access to the trams that circulate and stop at designated locations about every 15 minutes. You get on and get off the trams at your leisure, and the tour guides share a lot of interesting information about the cemetery. They will also point out famous grave sites. I think the tours were about $20 per person. It is an actively growing cemetery, and we were told there were 25 burial services taking place the day we were there. Out of respect for the service member and their families, if a burial service is taking place near the tram route, they will shut that stretch down during the service. Arlington National Cemetery is definitely a site to have on your to-do list, but it's one that'll take at least half a day if you want to see most of it. While in DC, we were recommended a site called freetoursbyfoot.com, which I have no affiliation with, but schedules free walking tours around Washington, D.C. and many other cities. The tours are led by tour guides who work for tips. Because they work for tips, they tend to bring their A game and know their stuff. Check out the various tours they have, including a DC ghost tour and a tour specifically following the Lincoln assassination events. Fascinating. Real quick, if you've made it this far, giving the video a like would mean the world to me. Thank you so much. Museums. My third category of attractions are the museums. There are tons of museums in Washington, D.C., and most are completely free to explore on your own. Some you could easily spend an entire day or more in if you wanted to, but they're generally viewed at your own pace. Many museums are part of the Smithsonian Institution and located near the National Mall. The biggest ones include the Museum of Natural History, the Museum of American History, the National Air and Space Museum, the American Art Museum, and the African American History and Culture Museum. We did not have time for all of these and missed many others I didn't list that we would love to have gotten to. We did visit the Natural History Museum, which has exhibits on fossils, the origins of humans, and a lot of other natural science stuff. This would be pretty interesting for young kids, I think. You can even see the actual Hope Diamond on display here. And we saw the American History Museum, which was both of our favorites overall, probably. The exhibits are an eclectic mix of American history, including war history, pop culture, politics, business, and we got to see a collection of dresses worn by many of the first ladies dating back to the 1800s. I could have easily spent an entire day here except for one reason, which I'll cover in just a minute. Let's talk about the Air and Space Museum, because there are some things you need to know about this one. There are actually two locations for the Air and Space Museum. There's the museum itself, which is on the National Mall. This is the only one we found that required a ticket to enter. It's free, you don't have to pay, but you do have to get a ticket in advance from the Smithsonian website. A limited number of same-day tickets are made available every day at 8:30 a.m. We were never able to get one, and this likely shows just how popular this museum is. But the other Air and Space Museum location is the Udvar-Hazy Center, also known as the Air and Space Museum Annex. This is located a good distance away, just outside of Dulles International Airport. No tickets required here, and several people told us that if we only got to see one of the two locations, this is the one to go to. We took Metro most of the way, and although there was an option for a bus, we opted to take a $6 Uber ride the rest of the way. The museum is a giant aircraft hangar filled with all kinds of aircraft and other air and space equipment. Military planes, commercial planes, helicopters, missiles, drones, astronaut suits, simulators, you name it. We saw the actual Enola Gay, which dropped the A-bomb on Japan to end World War II. We saw one of the iconic supersonic Concorde commercial airliners, which stopped operating back in 2003. And we saw the Space Shuttle Discovery Orbiter, which now calls the museum home. It's one of only 3 existing space shuttles that actually flew in space. It was huge. It was incredible. You got to see it. I'm not an aviation fanatic, and I still found this place absolutely fascinating. I especially geeked out on a lot of the space stuff. I'll link to an entire video about just this museum, but the important things to know are that there are 2 locations for the Air and Space Museum, and one of them requires advance tickets. Another quick museum to see back in DC is the National Archives. Among other things, you can see the original Declaration of Independence, like the actual document that was signed, as well as the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. They're all housed in the museum's rotunda, and you just walk right in. There's no tickets necessary. Since it was right next to our hotel, we checked out the International Spy Museum. This is the only museum we found where we had to pay to see it. Tickets were like $35 each. It's big and it's interesting, but unless you're really interested in the history of spying and espionage, I would skip it. For an extra $12, you could see all the James Bond vehicles from the movies. We didn't do that part. The long list of museums we wanted to see but didn't get to included the African American History and Culture Museum, the Bible Museum, and the National Portraits Gallery, which was highly recommended by some friends living in DC. Okay, let's talk about where to eat in Washington, D.C. There are tons of restaurants spanning every type of food and price range. The hardest thing we encountered was picking which restaurants to try, and for the most part, we were never disappointed. Since it was close to our hotel, most nights we walked down to the wharf area, which is packed with restaurants and bars. On the wharf, we ate at Bar Taco, which is a hipster taco restaurant, Brighton, a British pub, Kinfolk, which serves Southern comfort food and had the best happy hour that we found, and a place called The Grill, which had some pretty decent burgers. There were many more that we didn't get a chance to try, including Hell's Kitchen. North of the National Mall is an area called Penn Quarter, where some of the more historical and iconic restaurants were. We ate at Old Ebbitt's Grill, which is probably the most famous restaurant in Washington, D.C. It was huge, and around lunch and dinner times, you'll probably need reservations. Some of the mounted animals on the wall are actually from Teddy Roosevelt's collection. And then one day we ate at the Capitol Grill, which was probably our favorite place in terms of food and atmosphere, but it was a little pricey. Also, most of the museums have food courts, and the shopping center below our hotel had several quick places to grab food that looked reasonably priced. There are also plenty of bars and nightlife. One night in the wharf, we went up to the 12 stories rooftop bar for a drink, and the view was awesome. One evening, we took the metro out to Alexandria, which is a cool town, and we walked around downtown a little bit. We ate at Bugsy's Pizza, and we really enjoyed it. Alexandria is where a lot of people who work in D.C. actually live, and it's about 20 minutes by train from central D.C. Before I get into some of the do's and don'ts that we learned, let me quickly talk about the airports. There are two main airports you can use to travel to Washington, D.C. Dulles International Airport is the larger of the two, but it's further away, almost an hour by metro. Ronald Reagan International is much closer to downtown D.C., but it's the smaller of the two. Both are connected to the D.C. Metro line, so they're very easy to get to and from. We flew out of Dulles, and we found more options for flights there. But we learned that when you fly in and out of Reagan, you get some amazing views of the city and the monuments. I really don't know how the prices differ between the airports, but make sure you look at both airports before you book. Okay, so here's some lessons we learned to wrap this up. First off, we found the metro trains to be very valuable. They took us all over the place for between $2 and $6 per trip. You can buy all-day passes for $13 and 3-day passes for $28. You load a card, or you can load it on your Apple Wallet, and once you figure out the different colored lines and how to read the metro map, it's really easy and fast to go around the Washington, D.C. metro. Also, in the area of transportation, there are bikes, e-bikes, and scooters everywhere. At first, I was kind of annoyed how many of them there were, but after walking constantly for 2 days, my wife and I tried both the scooters and the e-bikes, and it was the best way to get around town, especially in the National Mall area. We used the Uber app for the Lime scooters and bikes. A friend used the Bird scooter app. They saved us a lot of time and walking if you feel comfortable riding them. They cost $1 to unlock and 51 cents per minute to ride after that. If you were to rent a car, I'm sure you could see much more around town, but parking overnight at the hotel was $65 a night, so be warned. We had no problem getting around between metro, scooters, and an occasional Uber. About the timing of our trip, we went in May, specifically to be there for National Police Week and to participate in the massive candlelight vigil held on the National Mall. That was a great experience, and the weather was really good. But we learned that May is also the peak time of the year for 8th grade field trips to Washington, D.C. There were thousands and thousands of kids on field trips while we were there. Some areas weren't that bad, but it was miserable in some of the museums. Kids were running all over, and it was absolutely packed. Next time, we will probably look to travel earlier in the spring to see the cherry blossoms and avoid the field trip crowds. I'm assuming that between Police Week and the field trips, the prices of hotels were probably higher when we went than in other times, but I'm not positive about that. Any tours you really want to take, book them in advance, but be flexible because you'll stumble across things that weren't on your itinerary and that you'll want to see. Washington, D.C. was absolutely great. The Hilton Hotel was great. I'll put some helpful links in the description, and here's a related video about Washington, D.C. I hope this is useful for any first-time D.C. travelers like we were. This channel covers a lot of random stuff, but I have a travel playlist with more videos like this and more about Washington, D.C. travel. Thanks for the like, and have a great trip.